And good afternoon. You're listening to Ken Hudnall. This is the Ken Hudnall Show. Coming to you from our studios right here in exciting El Paso, Texas. Gateway to the Old West and the most haunted city in the country. Well, today is June the 24th, 175th day of this year. Just 190 days remain till the year is over with. We'll start a new one. And falling in the heart of summer, this date's heavily celebrated with seasonal and cultural events worldwide. It's widely celebrated across Scandinavian, Northern European countries with bonfires and flower crowns and dancing. It's called Midsummer. The Saint Jean Baptiste Day, major cultural holiday in Quebec, Canada, celebrated with parades and barbecues and parties. International Day of Women in Diplomacy, global observance highlighting the achievements of female diplomats. On his date in 1983, Space Shuttle Challenger landed safely at Edwards Air Force Base. Concluding the mission, it made Sally Ride the first American woman in space. And for those that live in Mexico, it's Claudia Sheinbaum's birthday. She's the president of Mexico. She's giving a party. Y'all might just stop by and wish her a happy birthday. Well, on that note, let's see what's in the news, because there's always things going on. Well, far-left trifecta, backed by the New York City leftist mayor, routs party establishment in what's called a primary blowout. The Mamdani has got quite a following. And the candidates he's backed have ousted Democrat establishment incumbents. 1 year after sending political shockwaves across the country with his New York City Democratic primary victory on his way to winning election as mayor of the nation's most populated city, Mamdani tested the limits of his political powers. Easily passed the test up in the Democratic Party establishment as the trio of Mamdani-endorsed far-left congressional candidates won their primaries over more moderate incumbents and rivals. He was the biggest winner yesterday, but President Trump also covered his bases. As New York, Maryland, Utah, and South Carolina held primaries and runoff elections, the Mamdani's most shocking victory came in New York's 13th congressional district. Mamdani-backed candidate Darya Avila Chevalier, 32-year-old community organizer and Democratic socialist, narrowly topped incumbent Democrat Adriano Espaillat, 71-year-old congressional Hispanic caucus chair and first Dominican-American elected to the U.S. House. Espaillat, who's been in Congress for a decade, was supported by a slew of party leaders, including New York Governor Kathy Hochul. In the race to succeed retiring Democratic Representative Nadia Velasquez, Dami-endorsed State Assembly member Clara Valdez, who's also aligned with the Democratic Socialists of America, down Brooklyn Borough President Antonio Reynoso by double digits. Reynoso was supported by Velasquez, was down by more than 20 points. According to what Valdez said in declaring victory. Tonight, we haven't won just an election. We've declared that this movement is durable. It's growing. It's not going to stop until working people no longer asked to just build a table, no longer just offer a seat at the table, but will run the table. We'll see how that continues. And the third Mamdani-backed congressional candidate, progressive Brad Lander, ousted incumbent Democratic Representative Dan Goldman Lander, the former New York City Comptroller, ran against Mondami last year in a crowded Democratic primary field, but became one of his biggest backers in the general election. So Chevalier, Valdez, and Lander showcased the mayor's platform of focusing on affordability in a city with one of the nation's highest cost of living. And all three were very critical of Israel. After seeing historically communism and socialism really haven't worked, it's making a major move that we're going to have to wind up, I believe, having to pay for. Well, the next parade attendee who dumped trash on the sidewalk identified as J.P. Morgan Chase DEI executive. That individual was promptly fired. New York Knicks winning the NBA Finals was a tremendous accomplishment for the organization and its players. Also brought a joyous end to the team's long championship drought for fans. Also an excuse for those same fans to engage in some typically New York behavior in the aftermath of celebrations, particularly during the celebratory parade that went down the city's Canyon of Heroes corridor on June 18th. Fans climbed on top of cars and garbage trucks and just about any elevated surface for a better view. Nobody attracted more attention than a woman who spotted a Knicks colored trash can and promptly dumped its contents on the street. It even exemplified everything wrong with sports fans being unable to behave themselves during celebrations and parades. And it turns out the woman responsible exemplified everything wrong with corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion culture. Tuesday night, the New York Post reported that the woman had been identified as Angie Baez, a 40-year-old financial industry executive. The Post report identified her LinkedIn profile, listing her as Executive Director of Community and Industry Engagement for Card and Connected Commerce at J.P. Morgan Chase. Her previous work included serving as Executive Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Infatuation, a website that reviews restaurants and neighborhood activities. Chase bought that site in 2021 to grow the portfolio of lifestyle-based content for cardholders. Yeah, Post contacted J.P. Morgan Chase to confirm that Bay has been fired, saying in a statement this employee is no longer with the company. Well, her bio on the Infatuation's website originally stated her efforts have helped position the Infatuation as a trailblazer in the pursuit of a more equitable and relatable food media industry. It's since been removed from the site. Well, it seems that there is some justice. Not a lot, but some. Well, America's investigating UAP claims, unidentified aerial phenomena, and that's only the beginning. A few days ago, while staying in Teton Village, Wyoming, a gentleman approached the writer of the article I'm looking at because I heard about a book called Out of This World. Over the years, he's described the years he's been investigating more than 100 reports of unidentified aerial phenomena tied to rocket launches along Florida's Space Coast. Most proved explainable, he said, though a few did not. Then he went into a story involving a retired U.S. Navy officer who served as a military mortician and claimed that he'd examined what he believed were the bodies of non-human beings. Rather than accepting or dismissing the account, the receiver of the information asked the question any experienced analyst should ask: where are the photographs? The laboratory reports? Who maintained a chain of custody? Can any of it be independently corroborated? Well, conversation was a reminder of something that many people learned over 24 years as an Army officer and 22 as a Pentagon strategist. The greatest danger in today's UAP debate is not a government secrecy, it's public certainty. Some have already decided unidentified aerial phenomena prove extraterrestrial visitation. Others insist every report's nonsense or simple misidentification. And neither position unfortunately reflect disciplined analysis. Good intelligence work begins neither with belief nor disbelief. It begins with evidence. And I know in some of the stories I had related to me when I used to speak at Roswell, before I became politically unacceptable to the leftists who've taken it over. A lot of stories existed primarily in the minds of those that believed in them. Well, Carville warns Democrats need somebody that can win this GD thing. When asked if AOC is viable for president in 2028, Lord help us if she gets elected. Veteran Democratic strategist James Carville and his co-host Al Hunt offered their takes on why AOC, Democrat of New York, will not be a viable contender for the 2028 election. Both are staunch Democrats, but they've warned time and time again the party needs to shift away from far-left policies and social agendas if it wants to win elections. Mainstream America is not leftist. When one listener noted increasing talk of AOC's prospect as a 2028 contender, asking if America's ready for a female president, Hunt had an interesting answer. He said, I don't think AOC is going to be the nominee for the next president. I think she's a formidable communicator and figure. Democratic Party is not a left-wing party. He said, Republicans will have to paint the mandami and look at others, and they'll pick a new Washington mayor as a socialist. The Democratic Party is a mainstream progressive party, and AOC will be a force, but she's not that kind of force. Now, the problem is, in looking at how she got elected, there's some questions about the process that put her in office. And for me, that's certainly a game changer. And as for whether a woman can win, he argued this is entirely possible. But as with a candidate of any identity, it's quality that counts. The country's ready for a female president if you put up a good candidate. We've not put up a good female candidate thus far, and I don't know that'll be the case in 2028 or 2032. As with other identities, such as black or Jewish or gay contenders, they can win in state houses and with the right candidate, they do it in the national level as well. He said, let's face it, according to Carville, Hillary lost because of a distributional fluke. She carried the popular vote easily, but she had bad distribution, bad turnout. Harris didn't lose because she was a female. She didn't lose because she was a female, a non-white female. She lost because she was seen as a continuation of the status quo of the Biden era. American people wanted a change. And the fact nobody could understand what she was saying was another issue, or her word salad answers to various questions did cause serious issues. Well, according to Jonathan Turley, Arkansas Schools Teachers Union proves education can be improved. There's been a lot of writing over the years about the decline in public education in the U.S. Political power teachers' unions led to bloated budgets as schools pursued ideological agendas over educational advancements. Despite massive budgets, scores of students in major cities have continued to plummet or remain at dismal levels. And now Arkansas has shown what is possible if officials put education first. Scores in the state have soared after the implementation of reforms that many of us have advocated for years. It also shows that state governments, not the federal government, are critical in reversing our slide in educational performances as the administration moves forward toward eliminating the Department of Education. That's been a major issue with the education in this country. It became politicized. Educational identity became more important than frankly, knowledge. Well, there was a scare at Disneyland after a teenager exited the log ride moments before a 50-foot plunge. 13-year-old Disneyland guest was medically evaluated for exiting a ride vehicle and sliding down the final 50-foot plunge of Tiana's Bayou Adventure. This incident occurred Sunday on Tiana's Bayou Adventure, one of Disneyland's log flume rides, according to a Disneyland spokesperson. Boy got out of the log ride vehicle before the attraction's final descent. Cast member immediately stopped the ride, and the teen was later taken to a local hospital for evaluation. Evaluated as a precaution and later released. And the ride remained closed for the remainder of Sunday evening before reopening the next day, according to reports. Witnesses dismissed the incident online, described the boy sliding down that steep drop before emergency personnel arrived to check on him. One Reddit user who was riding the attraction at the time claimed several passengers saw the boy fall moments before the ride came to a stop. According to another, he attempted to exit the ride vehicle at the top of the final drop. The ride stop mechanism failed to engage and was already past the threshold for the vehicle to enter free fall. Another commenter said Disneyland security and medical personnel quickly responded to the scene. He was very lucky. That attraction opened in 2024, replacing Splash Mountain, and is inspired by Disney's animated film The Princess and the Frog. Fox News previously reported on another amusement ride accident that left two girls hospitalized after they fell from a Ferris wheel during a harvest festival in Louisiana. When a Ferris wheel hangs upside down, accidents do happen. Well, Florida man allegedly kidnapped a teen girl and hid her inside a clothes dryer before she called 911. Now, that Florida man was arrested after allegedly kidnapping the girl and hiding her inside a clothes dryer at his Key Largo home. Christopher Michael Veit, 53, faces charges including kidnapping and false imprisonment and unlawful sexual activity with a minor, according to the Monroe County Sheriff's Office. Authorities responded to a home on Miramar Drive at about 11:45 in the morning on Sunday. After the alleged victim called 911, reported she was being held hostage. Deputies later found the girl hidden inside a clothes dryer at the residence, according to investigators. Authorities said Veit restrained the girl before putting her inside the dryer. Investigators said he allegedly took the girl's cell phone after she said she wanted to leave. Victim was found without life-threatening injuries, according to the sheriff's office. Authorities said the girl was not from Key Largo, although her connection to Veit was not immediately clear. Investigators said they uncovered evidence of an ongoing sexual relationship between the man and the victim. The teen girl was taken to a local hospital for evaluation before being released into the custody of a family member. The Florida Department of Children and Families was notified after the incident. Detectives responded to the scene and collected evidence, officials said, including several sheets of counterfeit currency. He was into quite a lot of things. Well, President Trump scored a major win as Congress passed his housing crackdown on Wall Street investors. He scored a major legislative win after Congress cleared a sweeping housing bill aimed at expanding the nation's supply of homes and lowering cost. House lawmakers voted 358-32 in an overwhelmingly bipartisan vote Tuesday to approve the Senate-passed measure, with opposition coming solely from Republicans. Every Democrat president voted for the package. 21st Century Road to Housing Act, one of the most significant housing bills approved by Congress in decades, incorporates President Trump's proposal to ban large institutional investors from buying single-family homes. That's a measure designed to help individual buyers compete with private equity firms. Also, streamline federal environmental reviews for housing, loosen regulations around the construction of factory-built homes, and incentivize local governments to reform their zoning laws to allow for more home building. That's among its more than 45 provisions. No longer are bills containing just one provision. They have numerous provisions. especially under President Trump. Well, Tallarico says he hates Christianity in an unearthed interview with transgender Latinx theologian. Prominent Democrat running for a critical U.S. Senate seat in Texas told a self-identifying transgender queer Latinx podcast host he hates Christianity in a 2021 interview. In a recently resurfaced episode of the activist theology podcast, James Tallarico, a Democratic state lawmaker now running for the Senate, confided, "I always thought of myself as a Christian who hates Christianity." He went on to say, "I can always get drawn back into it because nowhere else and no other political philosophy, no other economic theory do I find anything nearly as truly radical or revolutionary as the teachings of that barefoot rabbi." Moments later, he told the podcast host he believed the teachings of Christ are similar to the teaching of the Buddha and other mystical traditions. Democrats are hopeful that Tallarico will flip one of Texas Senate seats blue for the first time in decades, which would be devastating for the GOP's odds of retaining an upper chamber majority. He's running against Republican Ken Paxton, who currently serves as Texas Attorney General. I was sorry to see Cronin lose, even though he has been a bit of a divisive personality over the last few years in things I've been involved in. Well, President Trump rips congressional Iran war powers vote as meaningless. The UN nuclear inspector is going to visit sites. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, R-U-T-T-E, on Tuesday voiced support for President Trump's criticism of NATO, but argued that despite some frustrations within the alliance, European members have provided support to U.S. military-led operations. His remarks came after Trump renewed pressure on NATO allies to increase contributions to collective defense and support alliance missions. According to Rutte, I completely back him on this when it comes to NATO. He appeared on the Fox News special report Brett Bauer show. He says, "I know there's disappointment, but let's see that these are isolated cases." He pointed to European support for military action against Iran, noting that thousands of flights originated from European bases to assist the mission. He said, "I totally understand the disappointment when you take, for example, Italy. 500 U.S. planes took off from U.S. bases in Italy to support the operation. So this is massive support." Also highlighted the logistical assistance provided by other allies. When you look at all of Europe again, it's between 4,000 and 5,000 sorties. A country like Romania, in its capital Bucharest, had to cut down on commercial air traffic because the airport was being used as a tanker facility. So all that's taking place in spite of comments to the contrary. Well, on that note, we're going to go to our main topic today. You know, for over 1,400 shows in this incarnation of the Ken Hudnall Show, we've talked about unsolved mysteries, lost treasures, ghosts, almost anything you could imagine. Well, there's one unsolved crime I want to talk about. The activities of D.B. Cooper. And of all of America's skyjackings, only that one remains unsolved. It was November 24th, 1971. Passenger using the name Dan Cooper hijacked Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305. It was going from Portland to Seattle. He threatened to blow up the plane with a bomb, and he demanded 4 parachutes and $200,000 in cash. Fearing the worst, Northwest Airlines agreed. Plane landed in Seattle. Cooper let the other passengers and some of the flight crew off the plane and had the money and the parachutes brought on board. Plane refueled, took off again, and at 10,000 feet, Cooper jumped from the back stairs of the Boeing 727 into the Pacific Northwest night. He was never seen again. Now, the press for some reason, began to call the skyjacker D.B. Cooper. And the FBI investigated thousands of leads. Suspects included a mass murderer, a college professor, a career criminal, and a World War II veteran. But all these were ruled out as the culprit. Over the last 40 years, new suspects have emerged, of course, and now we've got an unexamined lead that may point to an inside job. Well, before solving this particular crime, we need to figure out who he was and how he may have managed to pull off this unbelievable stunt without ever getting caught. Well, to most of us, when somebody pulls off what you might call the perfect crime, a lot of folks want to know who he was. And to this day, it's one of America's greatest unsolved robberies. Now, Robert Blevin wrote a book called Into the Blast that presents a promising lead. The individual in question, that suspect Blevins wrote about, is Kenneth Peter Christensen, former Northwest Airlines employee who was never really a formal suspect to be D.B. Cooper. But thanks to the book Into the Blast, Kenny Christensen has become the forefront of possible suspects. And Blevins does make a compelling case. He said, I'd say I'm 90 to 95% certain Christensen was D.B. Cooper. Now, you have to ask yourself how Dan Cooper became D.B., unless somebody knew him, which I doubt. According to Blevins, Christensen worked for the airline, had paratrooper training, had the opportunity to pull off the crime, had a lot of unexplained spending within a few months after the hijacking, lent his best friend's sister $5,000 in cash to buy a house, used another $16,000 to buy another house for himself. As far as anybody can tell, Kenny Christensen had one life before the hijacking and a completely different life afterwards. And you look at the numbers, you definitely start smelling something fishy. Working for Northwest Airlines, Christensen never earned more than $512 a month. I mean, that's an entire month. But even in the early 70s, that didn't go far. Within a few months of the skyjacking, he suddenly had a stash of money to throw around. So the question becomes, why didn't the FBI take a harder look at Christensen as a suspect? Well, Blevins had a list of up to 3 preconceptions the FBI brought to the case. Number 1, Christensen didn't match eyewitness descriptions of the skyjacker, and he had no previous criminal history. And the FBI didn't believe the skyjacker had military training or a military background. Now, I can tell you from my experience, military background does give you insights into various things that D.B. Cooper brought to the table, such as jumping out of an airplane, which I don't recommend. Now, first, let's look at the name, D.B. Cooper. He's the most famous skyjacker in history. But that name is actually a fabrication invented by the press. Nobody seems to know where it originated, though. As far as the skyjacker himself, he actually put the name Dan Cooper on his ticket. Name many folks think he got from his Franco-Belgian comic book. So the possibility still remains that the alias Dan Cooper came from a comic book. I mean, he just as easily have called himself Clark Kent. Nobody's going to check. So if you look at it piece by piece, starting with the most glaring question, why would the FBI think D.B. Cooper had no military training? And that's a question nobody's ever satisfactorily answered, to my way of thinking. According to Blevins, the parachute that D.B. Cooper actually jumped with is called a Navy Backpack 6, and it's a smaller parachute, more of a military type. So the skyjacker was a pretty tough guy. And Kenny Christensen went through paratrooper training where they started out with 262 men and ended up with 80 that actually finished, and he was one of the 80. All these factors have convinced the Blevins that he actually solved the D.B. Cooper case. Now, he doesn't have many doubts that Christensen's the culprit. He said, I think he jumped out of the back of the 727, hit the ground, popped off his parachute, disconnected the harness and the container from it, buried the silk in the ground, and put his briefcase and the money bag into the container for the parachute and put it on his back and walked out of the woods. Well, the first look, you might think that Blevins' case is mostly circumstantial, which means we need to look at other pieces of evidence and a lot of other circumstances to tell us whether Kenny Christensen was really D.B. Cooper. I tried to investigate whether Cooper really was the late Kenny Christensen. It goes from the writer Robert Blevins to Kenny's brother Lyle, who dropped an amazing bombshell when he was interviewed. He said before he passed away, now Kenny Christensen died in 1994. He told his brother on his deathbed, "It's something you ought to know, but I can't tell you." Now, the entire scenario with D.B. Cooper is all but unimaginable today. But you have to remember, this was in the early 70s, and airline security was nothing like it is now. No ID checks before boarding a plane. You can still smoke on board, like Studio 54 up there, according to a lot of folks. After the D.B. Cooper skyjacking, things began to change. Boeing installed something they call the Cooper vane in the rear doors of the all 727, make it impossible to lower those doors from inside the airplane. FAA also began installing metal detectors in airports to screen passengers and their carry-on luggage. Before that, if you could pick it up, you could carry it on board the plane. Well, I've long heard, don't believe everything you hear. There's only one exception to that. And most folks believe anything said in the deathbed confession. After his near confession to his brother, Lyle spent years thinking about Kenny's life and decided he needed to examine his brother's possessions much more carefully. And what was the first thing he found? According to Lyle, on the day his brother almost made a confession to him, skyjacker came to the airline with an attaché case, and that very same attaché case was found in Kenny Christensen's possession. Well, on the one hand, I probably have an attaché case here that looks like it. Doesn't mean I'm D.B. Cooper. And then Lyle started looking at the composite sketch that law enforcement put together. Description of D.B. Cooper when he boarded that flight were all the same, wearing a black suit and a tie and carrying a briefcase. He's tall, dark-haired. And the FBI put out a bulletin featuring a sketch based on eyewitness reports. And then Lyle came up with a photo to support his contention. He said, I found this photo in his photo album. Must have looked at the photo book a lot of times, never caught it. And one day I said, wait a minute. He's carrying a bag, looks like a bag of money. And he's got an attaché case that looks just like the one that D.B. Cooper carried. Now, that doesn't make him guilty. In fact, the Dan Cooper boarded the flight wearing a black suit and tie and carrying a briefcase was described by eyewitnesses as having dark hair, being in his 40s, and standing 5 foot 10 inches tall. Well, Kenny Christensen, for his part, was bald, 5 foot 8 inches, so the physical descriptions didn't match. But let's face it, folks, eyewitness accounts are fairly unreliable. They're dubious at best, and the other thing we know, Lyle said that Kenny used to wear a toupee prior to the skyjacking. Never wore it again after the skyjacking. I mean, circumstantial, of course, but if it's possible, we need something more concrete. So there were other aspects looked at by Lyle. D.B. Cooper was left-handed, and so was Kenny Christensen. On the plane, the skyjacker ordered bourbon. Kenny Christensen drank bourbon. Skyjacker smoked, and so did Kenny. But maybe the most interesting of all was the photo that Lyle turned up with. Kenny Christensen carrying a briefcase and what looked like a paper bag full of money. First, it just looked like any other old photo. But in this particular case, that picture had been in the Kenny Christensen photo album, hidden behind another picture. Hiding a photo of yourself walking in with your big bag of money is unusual. Might make you raise an eyebrow or two. Even assuming all this is true, though, when you look at the case, it's still missing the most important thing of all. What was his motive for carrying out the skyjacking? Would cause somebody who had been, by all accounts, a quiet man that caused little trouble to suddenly pull off the biggest unsolved crime in American aviation history. And why would you commit a crime against your own employer? Turns out there's an explanation for that as well. One that's found in Kenny Christensen's own handwriting. According to his letters, he was never able to earn a stable living at Northwest because of constant protracted labor disputes at his job. In fact, there were 8 strikes at Northwest Airlines between 1954 and 1971. And those strikes severely cut into his earning power, constantly having to take odd jobs like working in a hotel or digging ditches for friends just to make ends meet. And that's, according to his brother, not a euphemism. Kenny Christensen was actually digging ditches with a shovel. In the meantime, the $8 million jets that he worked on sat unused on the ground. This hard-working former paratrooper resented it, of course. And if we're going to believe Kenny Christensen was D.B. Cooper, that in 1971 he'd simply had enough and decided to strike out at the airline to make him pay for the struggles it put him through. And right there, according to many, that's the first taste of an actual motive. But in addition to the possible motive, there are Christensen's bank statements. At the time of his death, the man who used to dig ditches had $186,000 socked away in savings, over $20,000 in his checking account. And add to that the sums he spent freely in the months after the skyjacking. That gives you another piece of the puzzle. Even with the motive and overflowing bank account, it doesn't mean he was absolutely D.B. Cooper. But when you stack all those pieces together, you do have to wonder, could it all be coincidence? And even more than that, why wasn't he one of the FBI's suspects? That's always been a question in my mind. So the question of whether or not D.B. Cooper survived the jump is an important question. Former FBI agent Ralph Himmelsbach said he thought it was highly unlikely. But in April 1972, a man named Richard McCoy skyjacked United Airlines 727 and demanded $500,000. He jumped at 16,000 feet while the plane was traveling 200 miles per hour, and he did survive. Similarities to the Cooper case were such that authorities thought for a while that McCoy was D.B. Cooper. But McCoy didn't resemble the description of Cooper at all, and it turned out that he'd been home having a Thanksgiving dinner in Utah when Cooper pulled off his caper. But the point is, if McCoy could survive a jump from 6,000 feet higher than Cooper, you can't just dismiss Cooper's jump and say it's unlikely he survived. Of course, when the FBI was questioned, they said D.B. Cooper case was never solved, and as a result, it's still an open investigation. But that questioning did turn up something else. Ralph Himmelsbach. The retired FBI agent was actually in charge of the Cooper investigation from 71 to 80. He described the night of the skyjacking as stormy and windy and rainy. Lousy night for flying at all, much less jumping out of a jet airplane. But he did help civilian investigators reconstruct the crime and understand how the FBI saw it. He arranged for investigators to accompany him on a Boeing 727 in 1971, the most widely flown airliner in the world. Now, Dan Cooper, which was the name on his ticket, he wouldn't become D.B. Cooper until the days after the skyjacking. It was in seat 18C. And as the flight attendant approached him, he handed her a note and said, "You better read this. I've got a bomb." He told her to take that note up to the cockpit, and his instructions to him was to stay in the air until they got to Seattle, where the money and the parachutes were obtained. He said if they did anything wrong, he'd set off the bomb. So at this point, based on information from the airline, we know where Cooper was sitting. We know about the note and the demands he made. When the FBI asked the airline how they wanted to deal with the hijacker, the head of the airline was determined to keep everybody safe. They agreed to pay the ransom, handed over the 4 parachutes the hijacker demanded. And at that point, the skyjacker selected an older-style military parachute of the sort that Kenny Christensen might have been familiar with. Then he opened the rear door of the 727 and at 10,000 feet, jumped. After that, he was never seen or heard from again. And Himmelsbach thinks there's a good reason for that. He doesn't think Cooper survived the jump. He said, "I can't say it wasn't survivable, but it's unlikely. The airliner was going 170 knots at 10,000 feet. Outside air temperature was 7 degrees below zero, with a chill factor of about 69 degrees below zero. Well, that's a strong point for investigators. Doesn't answer the most important question, the question people have been asking for 4 decades. If Cooper didn't survive the jump, why was no trace of the body ever found? According to Himmelsbach, there's the best explanation I can give you is just go look at the woods. And that's the FBI's explanation. They believe Cooper died in the jump. His body was claimed by some animal in the woods, and his clothing, parachute, and all the money was lost in time and the elements. And that's for why they didn't think he was a Northwest Airlines employee. They said he would have been recognized by somebody. Well, I was vice president, general counsel of a company that employed almost 2,000 people. A lot of folks worked there I wouldn't have recognized if they walked up and bit me. Well, both of these certainties Himmelsbach talked about, certainly explanations, not just explanations that have the benefit of being 100% certain. Now, one thing you have to consider, the FBI may have underestimated just how smart Cooper was and how carefully he prepared his heist. He insisted the pilot stay below 10,000 feet. Any higher, and they'd have to pressurize the cabin, make it even harder for Cooper to open the plane's rear door and escape. He asked that the flaps be set at exactly 15 degrees. You might ask why that was, because at that angle, the 727 couldn't fly any faster than 200 knots, which made it safer for Cooper to jump out. Any way you slice it, the guy knew what he was doing. He knew airplanes. He knew about how they worked, and he used that knowledge to his advantage. Now, of course, most of us aren't experts in jumping out of a jet aircraft, but there were some experts you can talk to. One of the people talked to by civilian investigators was a man named Larry Yount, parachute expert, more than 200 military jumps, more than 4,000 civilian skydives. While there's ever jumped from a plane moving at 200 miles per hour, civilian skydivers normally jump from planes traveling at about 90 miles per hour. He made military jumps from aircraft that are traveling at speeds up to 150 miles per hour. Well, the investigation of Kenny Christensen and his possessions continued all this time. There's some things found in his attic that raised questions. Now, nobody believed that so many years after the event, anything would have been found that would have been useful in maybe determining was Cooper Christensen. Now, in his attic, it was noticed some insulation had been moved around. So, during one of the investigations of his attic, the top of a trap door of a hiding place was found. And when they opened it up, the hiding place was empty, of course. But somebody made a small hiding place in an attic that was almost impossible to find. The house was owned by the guy who was a trained paratrooper, worked for Northwest Orient Airlines, drank bourbon, and smoked cigarettes, just like Cooper did. Same brand of cigarettes, as a matter of fact. He bought the house with cash and apparently left a bundle of $20 bills hidden outside that were found by some kids years later. And that's another interesting story. When D.B. Cooper jumped out of the airplane, he had a bag of money weighing 22 pounds tied to his waist. Would that have been too much weight for somebody jumping from the plane? Well, the Yount didn't think so. He said 22 pounds was almost inconsequential. Folks had done military jumps carrying as much as 150 pounds of equipment. Taking it a step further, if they recreated the conditions, would he be willing to, talking to Yount, jump out of a 727 at 200 miles per hour and at 10,000 feet? Well, Yount, of course, said yes. Then he added something that absolutely surprised all the folks trying to put this together. He said there are actually 727s in private fleets that are used for commercial skydiving. People pay extra money to go do the jump just like D.B. Cooper did. And I had read that several places. Not only are regular thrill seekers surviving the Cooper jump, they're making it a regular practice. Beyond making the assumption that Cooper died, the FBI's other argument against Christensen being Cooper is based on the belief he would have been known to the crew on Flight 305 as a Northwest Airlines employee. Well, interesting hypothesis until you realize that Flight 305 was a domestic flight. And much of Christensen's experience with Northwest was with international routes. Back then, there wasn't a lot of intermingling between domestic and overseas crews. So Kenny Christensen was, in fact, D.B. Cooper. He was certainly taking some risk he'd be recognized as a Northwest employee. But as he did with the plane's airspeed and altitude, it was a risk that he could minimize. And even after Christensen started throwing money around as he did in the wake of the skyjacking, he continued to work for Northwest Airlines for over 20 years. I mean, you've heard that old cliche, the criminal always returns to the scene of the crime. Kenny Christensen was D.B. Cooper. Not only returned to the scene, he collected a paycheck from him for close to 20 years. Well, at this point, there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that points to Christensen. But circumstantial evidence isn't going to solve the case. It needs some hard evidence. And in the case of D.B. Cooper, hard evidence would more than likely revolve around the money. Now, the statement that none of the money ever turned up is actually not true. In 2008, an 8-year-old boy who found the money was a grown man in his 30s. And he put some of the D.B. Cooper money that he had found up for auction in a Dallas auction house. The bidding for the most complete bills, and a lot of them were sadly worn. But the bidding started at $750 for a $20 bill. He finally sold for $6,572.50. People thought they were buying a piece of American history. Well, as I said earlier, on the night of the hijacking, D.B. Cooper asked for $200,000 in $20 bills, and he got it. In total, that meant he was carrying 10,000 $20 bills divided into 100 bundles for a total package that weighed about 22 pounds. But before the money was delivered, the FBI was smart. They ran the bills through a Recordac machine. It took a microfilm photograph of each bill, including the serial numbers. A few months after the skyjacking, the FBI published the serial numbers. It consisted of a 34-page list that showed people what to be on the alert for when $20 bills crossed their desk. None of those bills ever showed up, which was, of course, fascinating. However, in February 1980, an 8-year-old boy found a bundle of waterlogged and decomposing $20 bills on the banks of the Columbia River near Vancouver, Washington, about 40 miles from what authorities believe would have been D.B. Cooper's landing zone. That stack of $20 bills, when counted, came to $5,800. And the serial numbers are on the FBI's list of some of the 20s that were given to Cooper. And as far as anybody knows, this was the only confirmed incident of any of the D.B. Cooper money ever turning up. Now, even if Kenny Christensen did pull off the skyjacking, and even if he lost $5,800 in the ransom money during his escape, he'd still have a lot of bills he had to deal with. And because the serial numbers were so well known, he couldn't exactly take the bundles of money down to the nearest bank. So let me ask you, if you had a ton of money sitting around and you wanted to keep it safe, what would you do with it? Well, you'd certainly need a good hiding spot, which of course led investigators to the house that Christensen bought in Washington State not long after the skyjacking. Now today, that house has been converted into a print shop, but according to the current owner, Dan Rattenberry, the printing company in the first commercial business to be located in that converted house, which was sold a couple of times. Investigators asked, had any money been found on the property? Rattenberry said he hadn't, but people have. People have found money on this property, he said. When the owner I bought it from bulldozed all the trees around here, they unknowingly unearthed a plastic bag that had been ripped open from being dragged through the stumps. Kids were playing on the stumps, and they found a bag, and it had money in it. Well, on the property that used to belong to Kenny Christensen, when they bulldozed the trees, they found bags containing money. Now, of course, most folks would think it was just an urban myth. Also enough to make the civilian investigators bring in a modern infrared specialist who could scan the house and see if there was anything else hidden in the old walls. And that's when things got really interesting. Well, at that point, the man running the FBI investigation was getting close to retirement, and he the FBI wanted to put him at the pasture. He hadn't solved the case. But then something was found. At the back of the copy shop, the They were running a thermal scan on the walls and ceilings of what used to be Kenny Christensen's bedroom. In most spots, the thermal image read red, showing normal insulation. But they hit a spot where the scan suddenly went blue, turning up interesting spot directly above the bedroom. Spot where the insulation appeared to be far less thick than in the rest of the ceiling. Well, they thought it was probably just a break in the insulation, so one of the team members volunteered to go into the attic and investigate. He said there was a lot of insulation, definitely some of it pushed aside. Right where they saw that infrared scan turn blue, looks like something was there. He didn't see any money, but he did find a piece of the floor came up, a little space where something could certainly have been hidden. Actually, right above the bedroom where Kenny Christensen slept. And that's one way to keep your eyes on your money. Well, so unless you have secret trapdoors above your bedroom, this was certainly something unusual. Well, at this point, in a recap, Christensen had both the motive and the means to commit the crime. Checking out the house where he used to live, they found a suspicious hiding place, a hinged spot in the ceiling above his bedroom. And there are the local stories about money being found in a plastic bag in the woods behind the house. Well, in the letters that Christensen wrote his family, another name was mentioned, Bernie Gietzman, somebody important to Christensen. But the question became, was there a chance that Gietzman could also have been important to D.B. Cooper? Blevins thinks so, in the research he did for his book. He goes so far as to accuse Gietzman of being Christensen's accomplice. And what would an accomplice have done? Well, he could have driven Cooper to the Portland International Airport, dropped him off to catch the flight to Seattle, drove back up by himself to Paradise Point State Park, right next to the freeway in Battleground, less than 2 miles from where they found the money in 1980. In other words, he could have picked up Cooper once he hit the ground. According to Blevins, Bernie waited for Kenny, and Kenny jumped out, hiked out, back out to the freeway, and they met up, and Gietzman drove him home. Convincing scenario. However convincing that Blevins might sound, his theory is just a theory. Where's the hard, fast evidence? Well, Bernie Gietzman and Kenny Christensen knew each other for a long time. They worked side by side at the airline, refilling planes till Kenny moved to a job as a purser on the Northwest Tokyo flight. One point, Kenny Christensen was renting a room from Bernie and his wife. Kenny attended Bernie's wedding. The two guys played cards together. Bernie and Kenny were close friends for 40 years. And Bernie Gietzman has a reputation for being tight-lipped. He avoided talking about Kenny Christensen for a long time. But finally, he did open up. And we'll talk about what he said in tomorrow's show, because you run out of time for today. So until tomorrow at this time, this is Ken Hudnall for the Ken Hudnall Show, saying have a truly great evening. And you sleep, think about showers of $20 bills falling from the sky. Till tomorrow, this is Ken Hudnall for the Ken Hudnall Show, saying have a great evening.